Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining us this afternoon. My name is Susan Ward, and I'm with the Bureau of Student Wellness at the New Hampshire Department of Education. I'm here with Granite State Children's Alliance mental health clinician, Andrew Wolff. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist. Andrew will be discussing how the pandemic relates to traumatic stress, concerns regarding youth safety, and the role educators play in supporting and protecting our most at-risk youth inside and outside the virtual classroom. So thank you so much for your time today, Andrew. I know you are probably very busy, so we really appreciate you taking the time to open up these topics for discussion while also providing some insight from a clinician's perspective.
Sure thing, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
All right, so before we start, I'm going to take myself off the video just because it's a little distracting to have me in the corner. So give me a second to do that. And we're good. All right. So like Susan mentioned, today we're going to kind of cover a little bit about how this pandemic relates to trauma, family functioning, and also where educators and teachers kind of fit in helping reduce a lot of risk and concerns that have been coming up over the past few weeks, especially pertaining to youth safety. So to start, we'll talk a little bit about, my screen's frozen. There we go. Just some objectives for today. So we're gonna talk and identify some of the current impact this pandemic has had on society, family, and individual functioning. We're gonna go over a brief synopsis of trauma and traumatic stress. We're gonna identify some of the preconditions of trauma and how they relate to this pandemic specifically. And we are going to talk about strategies using trauma-informed approaches for teachers to help improve student and family wellness during some of these crazier times that seem to have an end nowhere in sight. So to start, COVID-19's national impact. Some of the things that families and society have been working through over the past couple of months have been travel bans, declarations of pandemics and national and state emergencies, mandated quarantines, self-quarantines, social distancing practices, school shutdowns and the transition to remote learning, non-essential business shutdowns, stay-at-home and shelter-in-place orders, and a lot of loss of friends, loss of families, community members, people who have unfortunately passed away because of this disease. And we'll talk a little bit more about other aspects of loss that pertain to the impact this pandemic has had outside of physical health. So to trickle down from some of that national impact, we want to look at how do these things affect families? What's going on within our families? And some of the biggest impacts we've seen, and you might have noticed in a lot of self-help articles out recently, talking a lot about disruptions in communication with supports. So we've had a lot of communication become interrupted and disrupted, whether that's with teachers, coaches, friends, extended family, religious services have been interrupted. These disruptions can bring up a lot for people and create a lot of stress in how they regain access to those social contacts and those connections that are really crucial in keeping families functioning at their best, keeping individuals functioning at their best. We've also had disruptions in our daily routines and structures. That's been another big one in the self-help articles, talking about taking this time to reset your routines, to get yourself back on a schedule, because it's very easy when we get knocked off the bike to kind of stay off of it. So how can we put consistency and predictability back into our lives when this pandemic has kind of blown it up in a few different ways? We've got increases in family expressed emotions. So think everyone can agree that we're all stressed and stressed at different levels, and we express that stress in different ways. So I kind of look at, your stereotypical home, 2 parents, a couple kids, almost being like a balloon right now, where there's stress pouring out of us in different ways. There's anger, there's anxiety, there might be sadness, and it's kind of like that balloon is filling up more and more and more. And you start to feel the pressure of that sometimes too within families. So you've got families dealing with a lot of different complex emotions, and they're all different ages depending on the family member, and how they cope with that differs as well. We've got adjustments for families that have to now work from home or provide remote learning from home. 2 different big disruptions that have happened are those transitions for people that, are fortunate enough to be able to work from home and adjusting to that kind of lifestyle. And then also for the parents who have to provide the remote learning while working from home. You're balancing a couple different jobs now, both as a professional, as a parent, and as a teacher, kind of compounding that stress, that feeling of being overwhelmed. We're dealing with job losses. That's starting to pick up in the news more and more week by week as unemployment claims of the information about unemployment comes out. So families are losing jobs, families are losing financial security. We're dealing with resource scarcity for families that had to transition to working from home or remote learning. Technology sometimes is still a problem, and whether it comes down to how fast your internet is or how stable the connection is can really play an important role as to how we're able to remain resilient during these trying times. Food scarcity has come up in the news a little bit more and more, with different food factories shutting down, meat packing factories having the virus spread within it. So families maybe not having as much access to food anymore can become a concern. We all are aware of the toilet paper gold rush of 2020 and kind of how that became a concern initially. Like I mentioned, finances as well, and also service restrictions and families maybe not having as much access to specific services as they used to, or families are trying to cope with some of the adjustments that services they're used to having in their home are needing to make as a result of the pandemic to limit its spread. And families are also coping with loss of essential activities that are deemed non-essential. So you're also looking at the impact of gym closures, yoga studios closing, YMCAs and Boys and Girls Clubs closing, daycare is no longer being available. And I like to look at this one as being very impactful on the functioning of a family. So if we take something like a gym closing, and let's say that gym is available to a whole family. So you've got a son or daughter that works out there, you have mom and dad that work out there, they provide daycare services as well. Losing that gym is a loss for every member of the family, and that adds up over time. So considering about how all of these organizations closing down isn't just one loss to a family, it could end up being 2 or 3 losses, depending on how affiliated each member of that family is to that essential service. So how do all these impacts funnel down into the individual and their mental health? So right now we've got a time of increased stress and a time of feeling very overwhelmed with all of the news, with all of the negative, with how do we function, how are we going to be able to stay healthy, how are we going to keep our kids and our families, functioning at their best. During times where there are global events occurring, research typically shows that we're dealing with some increased anxiety preceding and during the global event. So right now, anxiety related to the coronavirus, making its way internationally into the US borders, and now during kind of the anxiety pertaining, am I going to contract it? Am I spreading it? Anxiety related to how contracting it could disrupt my family, my job, so on and so forth. Research has also shown that depression rates typically go up following a global or national event. And I like to explain that as, during this time, we're all very heightened, we're all very alert, aware, and dedicating a lot of our body's natural energy to daily functioning and preparing ourselves, kind of preparing for the worst. And usually when that happens and the trigger or the stressors kind of go away or disappear, or maybe we kind of hit that peak and we see those numbers go back down, if we're referring to the pandemic, the same can also happen in our bodies. And typically that swing is very hard back down. And that's where you can see some depression kick in as we exit that heightened state into more of a depressed state. PTSD is another thing that is typically found to increase following global and national events. And we'll touch upon that a little bit more, specifically as to how this pandemic might relate to post-traumatic stress disorder and other trauma and stressor-related disorders. We're also dealing with a lot of isolation and increased loneliness. I'll speak for a lot of people. It really stinks not being able to hang out with my friends or even see coworkers as much anymore. So, our connections are usually our lifeline. Our connections are our energy for a lot of us, especially, those extroverts out there that enjoy getting energized off of their relationships with other people. So this has been a hard time for extroverts. And for introverts, because those social connections that they do maintain are that much more crucial to their own well-being as well. Hopelessness, not believing that this will ever end, that things will get better. We're on week 5 or 6, I believe, and getting closer to that May 4th date of the shelter-in-place order expiring. So we have a light at the tunnel, but we also have that feeling of, but they're going to probably extend it or do something different. So coping with that heavy feeling of really not believing things are going to change or get better has been difficult for a lot of us as well. Within that isolation, loneliness, and hopelessness, there's always an increase in suicide risk. So, take into consideration, reaching out to family, friends, offering check-ins. It's a tough time for everybody. It's really important to make sure you're maintaining those connections and ensuring, family and friends are well. Grief related to, loss of family and friends, grief related to separations from teachers, family members. So maybe there hasn't been a death in the family, but the sheer loss of a connection, physical, virtual, so on and so forth, has been enough to stir some feelings of grief and loss in both adults and children lately. Loss of control. It's hard for people to not have control over their surroundings, control over their own being. I don't think anyone likes to be told you have to stay at home and you have to stay at home this long and longer and so on and so forth. And oftentimes when people lose that sense of control, they might end up engaging in activities or acting out in ways that helps fulfill that need for control. And that'll come up a little bit when we talk about, how loss of control might relate to things like domestic violence, and wanting to regain a sense of control in your environment or reduce some of those triggers that might be contributing to feelings of a lack of control. And we also see increased substance use and substance abuse during these times. People will seek ways to numb some of the stress and anxiety they've been experiencing. Alcohol and other drugs are one of those alternatives that people turn to. The alcohol stores have been deemed essential businesses. So you can imagine that people are going to the stores, they're drinking more. They might not be intoxicating themselves to a point where it becomes unsafe, but that increased risk of substance use, alcohol consumption starts to become a concern. And when we think about all of these factors, all of these mental health factors, the impact on families, the impact on society, what we're ultimately here today to talk about and kind of following up after Stephanie and Jana presented yesterday on No and Tell, is that, you know, a lot of these factors relate to increased risk of domestic violence, physical and emotional abuse of children and adults, sexual abuse, and physical and emotional neglect. So the concern here has been, you know, hearing about the reports from DCYF decreasing by 50%, and hearing reports of protection orders being filed at an increased rate with police stations in regards to domestic violence. So when people are sheltered up in their homes, it's not always as pretty as we like to make it out to be, or believe it to be. And these are some of the reasons why people are really struggling with stress in a lot of different ways and for a lot of different reasons. So with that, we'll transition to talking a little bit about trauma and how that plays a role into all of this. So according to the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network, trauma is a frightening, dangerous, or violent event that poses a threat to a child's life or bodily integrity. Witnessing a traumatic event that threatens life or physical security of a loved one can also be traumatic. And then I have a little bullet point talking about traumatic separation, grief, and loss. So something I want to highlight within this is that trauma can both be experienced and witnessed. So when we think about kiddos, just because they haven't experienced abuse doesn't mean that they can't still present with traumatic symptoms due to witnessing or perceiving a traumatic event from happening. And I highlight that now, especially with families who have older adults that are in that risk population, where if kids find out on the news, you know, grandma or grandpa is about 65, and the news says that 60-year-olds are at risk of dying as a result of the disease, that can be enough to cause some traumatic stress within a younger kiddo. And then, as I mentioned too, that traumatic separation, that loss of those connections can also be difficult for certain kids, whether a family member works in a hospital and has to go in for multiple times or multiple hours throughout the day and then can't return for quarantine purposes, or being quarantined and separated from family members due to other things such as autoimmune disorders. That's a big one. I've got a family member who unfortunately can't connect with anybody outside of Zoom or see people because of their immune system being so compromised. So taking into consideration both the experience of trauma and the witnessing of trauma is a really important piece to understand. Traumatic stress is stress that results from the impact of the trauma on the individual child or family. And some of you may know, but trauma can produce strong emotions and reactions that tend to persist long after that threat or trauma has dissipated. So, you know, a child or an adult could experience a trauma and really not have those effects or the impact of it kind of break out for 3 months post-trauma, 6 months post-trauma, way longer down the road. Or it could pop up immediately, but the effects are long lasting. And that's because of changes in the brain chemistry and the way the brain functions as a result of the brain staying in a very heightened, overstimulated state that's designed to protect the body and the mind. So things that you might see would be hyperactivity in somebody who has a trauma history or a child with trauma. And that relates to them being alert, their mind staying alert and staying active because it helps them feel safe. You might see people with symptoms of depression, and that's often in relation to what's known as dissociation, which is which occurs within our brain as a function to separate ourselves from the pain that we're experiencing. It's got a numbing purpose. Some signs and symptoms of somebody experiencing trauma or traumatic stress: you might see some emotional dysregulation, changes in their behavior, anxiety and depression. With children and adults, you might find that they have problems forming attachments, maintaining connections, developing connections. You'll see avoidant behavior. You might hear about difficulty sleeping or eating. Nightmares is a really big one that comes up for younger kiddos and adults. You might notice academic difficulties, and you might see an increase in risk-taking behavior, including substance abuse. So I want to transition from this slide to talking about things that are known as the preconditions of trauma and traumatic stress. Preconditions meaning what makes trauma traumatic. And another aspect of this is that these conditions also facilitate and kind of mediate how likely it is that someone develops post-traumatic stress disorder and other disorders as a result of their trauma. And when I came across this information, it was profound information in the sense of how closely it relates to what we're all experiencing right now. It made me consider how, even our own experience without trauma per se in this time can be traumatic. So things that we're looking at that create trauma or compound trauma is having a lack of predictability. These are uncertain times. We don't know what's necessarily going to happen next. We couldn't really predict when this pandemic was going to hit, where it would hit, who it would affect the most. And I don't think any of us predicted that society would kind of all but stop. So predictability plays a role into whether or not trauma is impactful and how impactful it can be. Another precondition relates to immobility, where the weight of the trauma can definitely align with how much action we as an individual can take to defend ourselves, resist the trauma, stop the trauma. So I take that and compare it to shelter-in-place orders. We're being told to stay at home. We're being told to not get outside and not leave the confines of the four walls that are supposed to be our safe place. And for many of us, our home is supposed to be that safe and comforting place. For a lot of people, that home is not a safe place, and can really up that feeling of immobility, that feeling of having no control over your environment. Another precondition is loss of connections, and I talked a lot about that already, and how we're dealing with a lot of family separation, either through death or through just quarantines and social distancing practices. Another precondition is that numbing and spacing out piece. So again, going back to what I said about dissociation and how the mind is designed to protect ourselves by separating us from our pain when it becomes too stressful. So that numbing and spacing out comes into play as well with that increased risk or increased use of substances and alcohol. It's hard to cope with feelings of stress and overwhelming sensations, and often we seek ways to numb those. That's very comparable to what occurs with trauma or when we're experiencing traumatic stress. Another precondition is a lost sense of time. So I go back to that feeling of hopelessness I talked about, where we kind of lose sight of what day it is, what time it is, how long this is going to continue on, because it's been going on for so long. I don't know how many times I've had to ask my fiance what day it was, and realizing it might be a Saturday or Sunday, but I still found myself working, or my brain's stuck in that, oh, it's a Monday kind of feeling. So a lot of us are coping with, that lost sense of time, that kind of lack of grounding we have in our reality because of the stress that we're all experiencing. Loss of safety is another precondition, where trauma has a capability of kind of pulling the rug out from underneath us when it comes to feeling safe. Trauma is not something that's expected, it's never wanted, and it's a disruption of trust. It's a disruption in our attachments and our belief that the people around us can keep us safe, and can protect us. And it can even go further into an individual basis, saying, I can protect myself, I can keep myself safe. And we're also looking at a loss of purpose when it comes to trauma. So losing that individual identity, losing that family identity. Guilt and shame play a big role in the way we think about ourselves following a traumatic event, and can also change our sense of purpose or that role in life. So when I think about purpose and roles right now, a lot of families are dealing with role changes, whether it's with people working from home or with mom or dad having to spend more hours out of the home, and another parent having to kind of pick up the slack due to those changes. You might have a loss of purpose fall into when somebody loses a job and no longer has that role of a financial support to their family. So families are experiencing a lot of these, a lot of these preconditions, and therefore families are experiencing a lot of traumatic stress. And if, like I mentioned before, that stress kind of trickles down into a bunch of different ways. So I'll next talk about why this is all important, why trauma, why family, how are we all affected by this essentially? This stress, the stress related to the pandemic, has many layers. On the surface, we've got stress, traumatic stress related to specifically the pandemic in the sense of our health, our resources, our connections. How are we all coping with that? Those day-to-day stressors. Beneath that are individuals who might have previous trauma histories, who have maybe done the work to overcome it or are currently kind of coping with it, and have now been hit by this huge wave of stress related to the pandemic. So their stress is compounded. They might be reminded or triggered by some of, the things going on out in the world right now. Maybe the idea of being quarantined or being alone is a big trigger, and it's bringing up feelings from the past for them. So it's been a difficult and complex time when it comes to emotions for some people. And then that last layer is the stress related to present threats. So for families and kiddos who are involved in abusive situations, domestically violent situations, are experiencing very immediate safety concerns and stressors, and having these things compounded by the fact that they have a lack of resources or a lack of connections, and they aren't having interactions with the people that typically protect them the most, such as educators, daycare providers, so on and so forth. So it's important to recognize that impact on students and parents especially, and understand that people can be stressed right now from many of these different layers. They can show that stress at different times, and that stress can kind of come out in different ways depending on what layer it's coming from. My goal here today is to kind of raise some awareness around that trauma-informed aspect, and to highlight the importance of maintaining connections and developing connections to protect student and family well-being. So getting your voice out there, extending that hand in order to bring some light back into the lives of students and families, ultimately to protect our kids. Having an awareness of some of this information will also allow you to show a little more patience and compassion to others that you see are struggling, and will hopefully help you feel inclined to offer support to those who may be dealing with really complex situations and stressors, or very difficult ones. And ultimately, we want to help by reducing the traumatic stress and the risk of trauma while increasing a sense of safety and competence in our students and families. The most resilient people in the world are the ones who can establish that sense of safety and that sense of competence in who they are and what they can do. So the more we can make parents and students feel capable, the more likely they'll be able to mitigate some of these stressors and reduce that impact this pandemic has on them once it's finally over. So what can educators do? These will just be a couple strategies that you can bring into your virtual classrooms or your teaching practices in the next couple weeks. The first is helping make the unpredictable predictable. So taking that for one of those first preconditions I talked about, and help by providing lesson plans that are clear and simple. A parent might become overwhelmed trying to set up a teaching space for their kid, or might become overwhelmed by the information that needs to be presented, maybe because they don't know it or they don't understand it. So the clearer and the more simple that instruction can be from teacher to parent, the smoother it'll go from parent to student and hopefully reduce some of that stress. Another beneficial thing could be creating template learning schedules for parents and or students so that they can use it and or modify it when they bring it into their own lives. Teachers, by doing this, you're helping parents kind of organize their thoughts, or even students, especially during a really stressful time. We kind of lose our grips a little bit on some of the brain areas that help with executive functioning when we're highly stressed or anxious. So providing some of these little things can reduce some of that stress and hopefully kick us back into like a good learning brain. Providing parents and students with a learning calendar so they're aware of what's coming up in the next few weeks is another beneficial thing. I like to think about where, you know, students might be used to walking into a classroom and seeing a whiteboard or chalkboard, if those exist still, you know, announcements or due dates coming up, so on and so forth. So for educators to provide something like that to the parents and the students can help alleviate some of their anxiety related to uncertainty. And the last tip for, you know, turning the unpredictable predictable is maintaining or establishing consistent daily, weekly, or monthly contact with students and parents. You know, checking in and checking out is good, but we want to make sure that's consistent. We want to help our students and parents feel like they can trust the people that are there to support them, that are there to provide the education to their children. So keep that contact consistent or establish consistent contact, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly. Another big tip is help get your students moving. I talk a lot about the importance of exercise when it comes to well-being and mental health, and the value of moving our bodies, especially during a stressful time. So teachers have a very special role in that you can assign things. You can put it out there that somebody needs to do this in order to learn, and that can also be used to help better themselves or help them cope. So encourage activities that incorporate movements. You can assign activities like in-home scavenger hunts, or, you know, play I Spy when you're having a virtual contact with a student. Encourage breaks inside and outside the house. So using some of those learning schedules or the calendars, make sure you're throwing in breaks or notifying parents that breaks are important and here's what a break should look like. You know, kids might be more likely to get outside for recess than they would be to get outside right now, just given social distancing practices, quarantine, and the general state of affairs in New Hampshire. So encourage them being parents to get their kids outside or get their kids moving during those breaks. And also take an opportunity to explore what your students have been engaged in to let their energy out. You know, yesterday, Stephanie and Jana encouraged educators and all adults out there, you know, ask questions. You know, it's okay to be a nosy neighbor. We're all checking on each other to make sure we're safe and doing all right. So ask questions about what your students have been doing, because that can either spark conversation about things that can be done for those who aren't doing anything, or it can spark conversation around, you know, keep up the great work. That's awesome. That must feel really good for you to be able to get outside and play on the playground. Okay. So I just briefly want to talk about check-ins a little bit more, because I find that they're extremely important, especially right now when we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. This is a great time for educators, for adults, parents to focus on building relationships with students and their kids. First and foremost, you know, I saw a great quote talking about, you know, at the end of the day, when your focus is on getting somebody to do the dishes or this or that, and everyone's hit their limit, you know, your focus should really be on building that relationship, building trust, and establishing a connection. So this time is a great time to do that. how are you connecting with your students? How are you turning into what their learning's been like, what their emotions are, what they've been feeling, what they've been thinking? How are you establishing that contact as an educator? Having a routine way of checking in with your students is a great step towards developing and maintaining that connection. And that connection can be extremely beneficial when it comes to regulating and reducing stress for your students. Any contact you have, start that form of contact with the same set of questions, asking about how your students doing, what they've been doing, what's been working, what's not been working. Just making sure that it's something consistent, something your students can expect every time from you. It can help establish that conversation much better than going into a conversation not knowing what to expect. Another important aspect of this is to use your own self-report as an example response to further generate conversation between you and the student. So sometimes it might, like a kiddo might be a little more apprehensive to talk about what they're thinking or feeling because they don't have a good example of how to do that. So by you doing it and you offering yourself out first, you're already showing them how to talk about how they're thinking or feeling. And then another example is to check in on your students' energy. And I bring this one up because it feels a little less intrusive compared to asking specific questions about what have you been doing, who you've been hanging out with, things like that. And it allows for a little more wiggle room as far as responses that indicate how well your student's doing, and it gives you a little roadmap as to how to proceed. So we'll talk about that next. To start, you'd want to ask your students or your kiddos about where their energy's at. And you can use a scale from -10 to 10 or from 0 to 10. And start with a question just like, where's your energy level at right now? Or how high or low is your energy today? From there, you'd want to follow up and ask about their comfort with that energy. So how comfortable does that high energy feel in your body? Or how comfortable are you with your low energy today? From there, you'd want to ask about how their energy applies to their current situation. So how good of a match do you think your high energy is for getting your schoolwork done today? Or how good of a match do you think your low energy is for doing a FaceTime call with me right now? When students express that they're in a good place, my energy feels really good. I'm really comfortable right now. I think I'm ready to learn. That's awesome. Praise them for it. Let them know that it's fantastic. They feel that way. It's great that they're able to communicate that they feel that way. Maybe take some time to ask about things that they have been doing that have been helpful, because that puts in their mind that these things are good and that if I continue to do them, I can continue to feel good. And then if a student expresses difficulties with their energy, comfort, or that match between, you have a couple options. You can explore what they could do to bring their energy to where it needs to be or where it would be comfortable or match what they're doing. So if someone says that they have low energy, what do you think could make you feel a little more energized right now? Yeah, maybe it's eating lunch. Maybe they haven't had lunch yet. That opens the door for a conversation about, were you able to eat breakfast? What would you typically have for lunch to help you with your energy right now? You can also take the opportunity to validate some of those emotions and feelings and develop and form a trusted connection with your student or kiddo, in the sense that, I get it, that sucks. Like, it's really hard to get schoolwork done when you're feeling tired and when you're feeling like your energy's low. It can be really tough. I totally hear you. Just letting your student know that is enough for them to feel like they've been heard and to feel like someone recognizes maybe some of that struggle that's going on. Ultimately, what you would want to be doing is then helping guide them through, or helping them engage in an activity with you, to kind of bring their energy, their comfort to a place that is going to be helpful for the learning or for the purpose of your contact with them. This time, especially with where everyone's stress and anxiety levels are at, it's really important first to do a check-in to see where they are, so we can meet them there first, rather than expecting them or anticipating that they're going to be ready to jump right into the water with us. So another good reason to do those check-ins is just to ensure that people are kind of ready and prepared for what they're about to do next. So check in with your students, see if they're ready to learn. If they are, awesome. If they're not, let's try to work towards finding ways to get them into a place where they feel ready to learn and feel ready to connect. Okay, some more strategies. Going off that line of creating connections and maintaining connections, you are one of your students' greatest emotional and learning supports. Students might not show it to you, but they love you. You are extremely important to them, and they value all the information you hold, whether it's about the specific subject you teach or about life. You are an educator in their eyes, and therefore you've got the information that you can share with them. Interact with your students through as many different platforms as your communications policies allow. Expand your reach as much as you can. Contact them through email on a weekly basis. Contact them through video chats when allowed, weekly or monthly. Use a phone call if you have to contact a parent. Just get your voice out there, get your word out there to establish and maintain that connection, and help them feel like they've got somebody on their team that cares about them, that can hear their struggle if they are struggling, or can recognize things are going pretty well, and that's awesome. They're going to appreciate hearing the voice of somebody that doesn't live in their own home. You can also encourage connection through learning activities. So I'll take that from what I mentioned about encourage your students to move. Encourage your students to connect. I bring that up where, when I was in school, we would do family tree activities or learn about your family's cultural history. Now is a really, really good time to do those things with families that are having weekly Zoom calls, and you've got 16 people on a screen who all have different perspectives as to like what's most important to this family or that family. So take advantage of that. Have your students feel like they're connecting to other people in their family through their assignments, through the activities that you as an educator can give to them. And then similarly to, having conversations about what students are doing, ask your students about who they've been able to connect with. Ask your students if they've been able to touch base with their best friend or this person or that person. Explore where there might be lapses and offer support where possible to help reestablish some of those connections that might have been lost. Maybe you can bring two students that are friends together to talk about a certain project or something. I'm not sure if group projects is really a thing with the transition to remote learning, but there's opportunities within the education, like a student's education, to help bring those connections back to their lives if they've been lost because of this transition. And then we want to look at providing reassurance, reaffirming that people are doing well, validating that this is difficult, and also encouraging them and letting them know that they're going to get through it, whether it's a student or a parent, a friend, anybody. So this applies to parents and students. We want to give updates to them on their grades and their progress. A lot of students I've heard have been concerned about, the impact of grades on college applications, this, and that. So kind of communicating with parents and students and exploring with them where their anxieties lay, and if it relates to grades and progress, maybe giving the students and parents roadmaps that are concerned about their grades so they can have a better understanding. Maybe you need to provide it visually because they're a visual learner, not an auditory learner. So you could speak it to them, but they're not quite catching it. So maybe providing something visually to them that reassures that they're on track, that things will be okay. You want to make sure you're praising your students for their grades, efforts, and contributions. It's a weird time, it's a hard time, but if you find students are engaging in the content or the teaching in a way that's been really effective and beneficial to them, let them know it, let them hear it so they can continue doing it. And the same goes for parents and how they're supporting their students and how they're putting forth effort as well. Let parents know that you've seen improvements in their child's grades. Let parents know that you've been impressed with how they've been able to keep their students on task or keep their students kind of on target with their learning during this time. It'll be important for them to hear it from you. Another strategy is to incorporate wellness and mindfulness activities. And this is more geared towards, again, that check-in process of how can we bring our kiddos and students to a level that shows that they're ready and prepared to learn. And mindfulness activities have a lot of research around stress reduction. So you can help reduce student stress and parent stress in doing this as well. You can have students do deep breathing or some form of a mindful activity to start or end your contact. So maybe instead of doing a check-in, you have students do some deep belly breathing at the beginning, or you have them play a mindful game with you to establish that contact or to end that contact. You can, again, going back to the assignments, you can assign wellness-based tasks for the week. So have students document their experience through journaling or self-report with you. Make an assignment where you have to go on a walk twice a week and write about the things you saw, or maybe it deals with trying a new food or anything pertaining to wellness that you can kind of put out there, challenge students and their families to do, and encourage them to process it maybe through their writing or through their words, just to get them up, active, and being well. And again, explore what students and their families have been doing to take care of themselves. It's okay to ask questions about, what's been one thing that you've turned to the most during this stressful time? This is what I use. Those conversations are fine and they're encouraged, because again, it's about building connection, helping reestablish some of those bridges that were much easier to establish when we could look face to face at one another in the same room. And especially for educators, serve as a model of how these activities help. Serve as a model to normalize that we use these activities because we're feeling stressed, because we're feeling overwhelmed and anxious. So for educators especially, notice and express what you've been feeling, what you've been thinking, and share it in developmentally appropriate ways with your students. Share what you do to help with those thoughts and feelings as well. Provide a roadmap to your students to teach them how to do the same. Establishing safety. So that was another one of those preconditions where that loss of safety kicks in. So how are you communicating to parents and students when you can be contacted and how? How are you establishing that lifeline, that connection between you and the family as far as communication goes? Are there ways for parents or students to express a need to contact you? So you might have expressed that, you're available between these hours by phone or by email, but is there also an opportunity for parents or a student to express the need to contact you one-on-one? So I watched a video of one teacher who has a Google Doc survey type thing that goes out to her students as a form of attendance check-ins, and she had an option that allowed students to indicate or request a one-on-one conversation with their teacher. Is there opportunity within your school policies to establish something like that, just to allow students to express a need and not necessarily have to reach out first? Because when they can indicate that they might have a need to talk, that feeling is a lot more validated when a teacher reaches out and says, hey, I saw you needed to talk to me. When can we talk? Versus them having to directly reach out to you and ask to talk. Another question to consider is, how are you establishing a private teaching environment when interacting with your students? Is the environment you're in simple, calm, and distraction-free? Do you have kids roaming around if you're a teacher that has kids at home with you? And how are you encouraging parents and students to create a safe learning environment as well? So are you educating parents on places to have their students open or set up shop for the day to do their learning? Are you talking with students about what they might need? Do you have them home with fidget toys, or do they have access to fidget toys that they might need when they're home? And I bring that up because it can be pretty distracting when you're even on video with somebody, due to multiple things in the background. So that's like why I took my video off, because I would just constantly kind of have my eyes go back to the video of me, rather than staying focused and engaged on the PowerPoint. And the same could be said for a student. They might look like they're learning, but maybe they're getting distracted by the little light that's coming in through a blind, in the teacher's video. Or maybe they can hear their siblings playing in the background because they're in the same room that their siblings are playing in. So how are you establishing a safe, calm learning environment? And another important question to consider is what plans are in place between you, the student, and parents when safety becomes a current concern. So make sure you're asking students, or at least can answer the questions of where your students doing their schoolwork today, who else is home with them, who you can call if a safety concern does come up, just to, again, ensure that plans are in place to make sure we're keeping kids safe. And that will ultimately help kiddos feel a little more regulated. It'll develop trust between you as the educator and parents, to know that communication is allowed and will be granted, and this is how it's going to be handled during these specific times. So make safety an issue, make safety a present concern in the eyes of parents, students, and yourselves. Just to touch on some of the wellness and mindfulness activities that you can throw into your check-ins or your contact with students. One is known as the noticing game. So you can encourage students to notice 5 things about their environment or about your environment through video, and talk about those 5 things. And the goal here is to bring your students to the present, establish a dialogue, and ground them into whatever learning format or communication you're engaging with them right now. So that might be something like, I see the clock says it is 4:42. So that means that clock is an hour ahead of schedule right now, minus a couple minutes. But it brings you into the present moment. And that's really important right now in an age of anxiety and uncertainty, to bring us back into the present, to ground us with where we are. You can encourage students to do mindful breathing. Rather than bringing their focus to their environment, they're bringing it internally to their breath. So encouraging them to focus on their breathing for a couple minutes, a couple seconds. You can challenge them to focus on their breath by matching certain cadences of slow breathing and fast breathing, with the ultimate goal of slowing their breathing down. It can be a good joining activity and a good attunement activity as well. So a student can kind of feel very connected with you in the sense that you guys are breathing at the same pace. They're keeping up with you, they're connected with you, and they're regulated and ready to go with their learning. Kind of like the noticing game, you can also play the 5 senses game, where you share what your 5 senses are experiencing. So you can ask them, what do you feel right now? What are you tasting? What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you see? Bringing them into that present moment. And I included a link at the bottom. I understand you might not all have access to that, so I will figure out a way to get this link out, just to incorporate any of the mindfulness activities that are listed in there, for any educators interested in throwing a mindfulness activity into their curriculum or their check-in. So with that said, final thoughts. So we'll start with self-care. I saw a great quote today that said, you can't pour out your cup unless it's full. So take care of yourselves, take care of your families first. Fill up your cups in order to be able to pour some of that into the lives of your students, their parents, or any other people that you care about. Make sure that you're in your best place so that you can help them get to theirs. The next point, take bits and pieces from this. It's unrealistic to expect people to fully integrate all of this stuff and all of the trauma-informed interventions into a classroom or their daily teachings. I'm a firm believer that small bits and pieces placed in the right place can result in really big changes. So take something small away from this, throw it into your teaching or to your daily activities, and see what effect it has. Acknowledge and share your experiences. Like I mentioned, you're trusted in the lives of your students and have a powerful gift in validating and normalizing their experience. Show them how to express their thoughts and feelings, show them how to cope through your stories and experiences, be that trusted ally, advisor, guidance, teacher to your students, and help teach them things that might not necessarily pertain strictly to the classroom right now. Last but not least, this is going back to the safety and kind of follow up from Stephanie's conversation with you all yesterday. Don't question your judgment or your intuition right now. If your gut suspects something, ask a question about it, raise the concern, make a report. Don't sit and wait for validation on that feeling, act on it. That action will save a child's life. That action will help a family. Right now, we're in some really heavy, stressful times, and there are a lot of negative outcomes that people are at risk of experiencing. So the more we can kind of be alert, diligent, and responsive to what we're hearing and seeing, the more likely we're able to mitigate some of those risks and protect our students, protect our families. So with that said, here is my contact information. Feel free to reach out, either email or phone call. I love talking with people. I'd love to help out in any way I can if people do have questions or concerns that come up. So feel free to reach out. I'm going to turn my video back on now.
Andrew, thank you so much for all of that wonderful information. There are so many things that really just stood out to me. And I think one of the biggest things was how teachers are such a huge emotional and learning support system in a child's life. And, as a former teacher, I know in my gut for that to be true and how I felt for my students and their emotional reaction when we would connect in the classroom. But I think we even see it in some of those good news stories that we see if we're watching the news or on social media of how teachers go out of their way to connect with students, to maybe go sit in their driveway with a whiteboard and, show different examples and trying to get them to where they need to be. And I think that's such a great point, that they're a huge support system right now. And even if they're not in the classroom and that's really difficult, you had some great ways for them to still be emotionally connecting online as well. So I think that's really important. I love also how you talked about how it's so important to validate a child's feelings.
Yep.
That affirmation, like, yeah, I know this is horrible. I can tell that you're frustrated. I can tell that you're really upset. And then they start to say, yeah, wow, you really are listening to me. And that's huge, for parents to do that, and for teachers to do that. So a lot of great information. So thank you so much.
Yeah, anytime. And I know I geared a lot of this towards educators, but these fall into family activities too. You can take a lot of these things and just have it become your daily process with your family, and that's going to help your kids feel connected and safe as well. So
that's a
if you're
great
not
point.
a teacher, that's okay. Take these things with you and use them in your family as well.
That's right. You can take those skills with you and incorporate them into your daily lives with everybody. So thank you so much. And thanks for opening up this discussion. I think it's really important, especially now. And thank you everyone at home for joining us today. I do encourage you to reach out to Granite State Children's Alliance, also to Andrew, if you have any other questions, also the New Hampshire Department of Education. And please make sure you join us tomorrow at 3 p.m. We're going to have Granite State Children's Alliance Director of Victim Services and Quality Assurance, Nicole Ledoux, and New Hampshire ICAC Task Force Investigator Matthew Fleming. They're going to be discussing the importance of speaking to children about engaging in safe online behavior, the increase of reports and sites and apps to be aware of, and how to keep your child safe. So thank you again for joining us. Please stay safe and tune in tomorrow.
Thanks. Have a good one, everyone.
Thank you.